at the role that lawyers have played, Katharina Pistor has an interesting account to narrate. She talks about how law and lawyers have been coders of capital. So essentially, the role that law has played is creating the infrastructure for capitalism to thrive, survive, and replicate. Whether it is the origin of property law or whether we're looking at, say, the current debates around international trade law. And the legal system, in some ways, is designed to facilitate capital and not regulate it. So when you already have that base, that's the existing base on which questions of greenwashing and questions of green finance and environmental justice are situated, how else does the law then deal with that complexity? So it always tries to skew towards not just facilitating capital, but securing the needs of capital. So, which is why when challenging an industry still remains such a big question for lawyers, and even just the invention of corporations themselves as artificial legal persons. So in some sense, the evolution of law can be sort of tracked as generating, one can say, the barcode for capital to exist and subsist. Now, what happens when environmental law and environmental agreements, both internationally and domestically, start to operate in this extractive legality? When I say extractive legality, I mean that when the system is already designed to extract and for law to facilitate extraction, environmental law then comes into this space as quite a critical gaze on a lot of the functioning of the existing legal engagements, whether we refer to it as contract law or whether we refer to it as company law, right? And environmental law then, if it's kind of seen as sort of the rebellious space within the legal system, how much has it really managed to shape the other contours of the coding of capital? And sadly, that story has not been a pretty one. It's been one where environmental law has really generated progressive legal principles, but the implementation has been difficult. And this goes back to the point that Joe was making, that it's not that we don't have laws, it's just that they're not being implemented. But the choice of implementation of laws and the choice of prioritizing one legal framework over the other comes because the actors who are implementing these laws continue to operate in what I've started to identify as this extractive legality. So the radical possibilities that environmental law initially held was prohibitory. In some sense, it actually said, for example, no to a coal mine. And that's still seen as a very extreme form of environmental law when you talk to lawyers, especially corporate lawyers. The second is then environmental law transitioned both internationally and domestically to a more precautionary approach, which is let's look at the impact that a certain project is creating and let's try and mitigate or reduce that impact. Now, why are we seeing false solution and greenwashing is because we've kind of sidelined prohibitory and precautionary approaches and completely gone to compensatory mechanisms, right? Pardon the use of my language, but we've reached a situation where something has hit the fan and there's nothing that we can do to control it. So in some sense, law is responding to it by creating compensatory processes. Let's look at whether the oceans, like Ashish was saying, can absorb the carbon, or let's look at, creating more forests. And when you talk to lawyers who are sitting at that, intersection of dealing with these false solutions and creating laws to enable them, there's this strange idea that the environment can be managed, right? So the law continues to sort of function on that techno-managerial ideology. And it's also what you start to see happening in the law, and particularly this government, you must be seeing the rapid manner in which it's sort of amending environmental laws. It is because the radical possibilities that environmental law holds is a real affront to capitalism. And so how can we start to push for environmental law and lawyering to really decode capital? and to recode it differently. And to then, through that, transform the economic systems. And that's where I see the possibilities and the idea of moving forward. So environmental law has now gone from like back of the boondocks conversations, at least in legal circles, to now becoming a sexy topic, right? So the idea of environmental law and climate law has gained so much of momentum that it's attracting a wider community of lawyers. Lawyers tend to be a particular breed because they're quite siloed. So a contract lawyer, a family lawyer will never interact with an environmental lawyer. But suddenly you're seeing all of them come together on the question of the climate crisis. So you have family lawyers worried about the death of a child because of air pollution. What happens then to the idea of wills and testaments? Or if you look at contract lawyers, should we be putting in climate clauses within our contracts? And that's an exciting time. So we're seeing a move towards enforceability across these silos. And we're also seeing a sort of shifting element where within private law, which is sort of contract law, where certain contracts can only be agreed upon if the ecological damage can be reduced. So there are those conditionalities which are emerging, both in investment as well as other kinds of contracts. I'll quickly proceed to the others, but I think the point that I feel climate litigation is making is it's actually going back to the courts to push for progressive legal action and interpretation. And we're seeing this slew of cases all over the world. So that's an exciting possibility. Can courts and judges potentially try and sort of save the day to an extent? But there again, you're seeing lawyers who are coders of capital retaliate. So for example, there was a case where a Peruvian farmer took on the German energy giant RWE for the loss of farmland in Peru because of glaciers melting and their contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. But RWE has now taken the state of Germany in an international trade dispute, an international investment dispute within the tribunal. So there is still, the way in which capital is trying to sustain, or even the term just transition, like how are lawyers contributing to greenwashing that? There are lawyers who are arguing that fossil fuel companies who've invested in infrastructure, which is now going to be at a loss because of disinvestment from coal, as a requirement for compensation and just transition for the coal companies and fossil fuel majors. So there are different ways in which these terms get deployed. But just to quickly conclude, I think we're going to see an increasing importance of procedural law as opposed to substantive law. So how decisions get made as opposed to the substantive quality of those decisions and participatory approaches. And I think that's exciting. So a lot of citizen assemblies, say in Latin America, who are now contributing to making national climate action plans. Responsive regulation. I think regulation, which is going from facilitating to responding to the needs of citizens and the planet, is going to see a more important footing in how law gets made. And lastly, I think this is just a pledge to any lawyers in the audience, saying that lawyering in the Anthropocene is no longer going to be coding capital, but decoding it. And I would urge you to read the World Climate Lawyers Pledge, wherein there are a set of principles that is a group of lawyers have put together to push lawyers to influence all the different arenas of law to be more accountable to the planet.